CEO, thank you very much for taking time out to speak to us this afternoon. Maybe a good place to start would be, where did it all start for you?
I was born on a farm just outside a town called Virginia in the Free State, the mining area, commonly known as Totagauta, which means the goldfields area. And so when I was about 8 years or so, that was way back in the mid-1970s, our family then relocated to the old homeland of Cawe in the Eastern Free State. And that's where I grew up largely, attended school there. And the interesting thing is that we are a family of 8 children, 6 boys.
Wow.
I'm the youngest. And I always say that I dodged the bullet because all of my brothers worked from a very young age in the mining industry in the Free State after they completed school. I had the benefit of going through to Chawe and grew up there and until I completed high school. And then I moved over to the University of the North, the local campus there, to do a BCom degree. Interesting. Yes, at the time. Interestingly, I started doing a BSc, chemistry and biological sciences and so on. But in the second year, from conversations around campus, came this idea that, guys, let's not prepare ourselves only for the teaching profession. Let's do something in the area of commerce and in future try and make our way into the world of industry and commerce and so on. So in the second year, I changed over to do a BCom degree, which I then completed and started working for the Development Corporation there at the time, doing small business finance. That's where it all started, really. Yeah.
Talk to us, about the environment on campus at that point in time. Turfloop is probably known as one of the hotbeds of resistance in South Africa. It's probably got one of the most illustrious lists of alumni, right through from the president through to captains of industry in contemporary South Africa. How was the campus at that point in time, and more importantly, your later role working in the small business ecosystem in that area?
Look, the campus life at the time was, for many of us who came from poor families, it was very focused on studying. And so we sought to be the best students that we could be. And I think we managed. Many of us completed our primary qualifications at the required time. But there was a lot of politics on campus and a lot of mischief as well, but at the end of the day, we would be bundled out of campus when, there were events taking place countrywide and we would engage in protest actions and so on. I remember in the one instance, the police pitching up in the early hours of the morning, like 3 o'clock, and you get woken up in bed by these people who are looking over you and things like that. A couple of guys taken in. Many of us ran away, distributed all over the place. But yeah, that was that. But we passed. A lot of students at the time stayed the course and completed their studies. And then, of course, as I say, I started doing small business development finance. It was very interesting at the time. Basic due diligence work that we did. The businesses were largely small industrial enterprises, small retail enterprises. Now and then did a lot of property finance transactions in the commercial space, financing shopping malls and shopping centers and industrial estates and so on. And later on in life, I lived in Bloemfontein for 5 years or so doing the same kind of work. Interestingly, I then moved through to Pretoria and worked at the Department of Public Works for a short time. It was like, I think 18 months or something like that, which was very high pressure and but interesting at the same time. And then I moved to the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
And when you compare and contrast, you know, your early working life and some of the projects that you interacted with then, and you look at the same spaces. So it might have been a shopping center, you know, just outside what was then Petersburg that you might have been working with. And when you go back there now, many people, I guess, with a resigned look often say, we've probably lost that capability. We've probably lost a lot of those enterprises that were happening there. Do you share that sentiment? And if so, I mean, what do you think from your own experience were some of the key drivers of that?
Yeah, it was a function of industrial policy at the time, and you as an economist would know this from your economic history. At the time, there was an institution or a capability in government which was called the Decentralization Board. Used to provide a lot of incentives, tax, subsidies for remuneration or salaries and all sorts of things to encourage industrial development to happen in those areas which were called homelands. And yes, with the changes in 1994 and the changes in policy from that perspective, many of those areas have been left largely destitute. There is an initiative at the moment in the Department of Trade and Industry to relook at those because, to your question, the way the pattern of industrial development has happened over the years is that you have these main centers in Gauteng, in the Western Cape, and in Durban, which are huge magnets of industrial enterprise establishment. So, but then, what we are then sitting with is a problem of spatial inequity, where there is large populations of people still who live in those less developed areas who need as much economic development assistance as can be provided. So there is this particular initiative to see the extent to which industries in those areas could be propped up. And it was an interesting part of my studies when I was doing development economics. Just on that, what I did is, in my life, I studied a master's degree in business leadership with UNISA. And later on, I did another master's degree with the University of London by correspondence, did an MSc in development finance. And interestingly, I looked at regional development as well.
And in that work, I mean, one of the things, it's quite interesting when you mentioned policy, is what then does this phase of revitalizing many of those areas look like? When you don't potentially maybe have the tax breaks that the decentralization board would have had at its disposal, and with a liberalized trade environment, how do you ensure that you sustain industry in some of those places?
Look, it is complicated, but I think the basic building blocks are, one, that these special areas need to have their basics right. So there is need for adequate infrastructure to be available in the form of credible and decent electricity supply networks, which talks to the need for municipalities in local areas and districts to have their act in place in terms of providing those basic services. Secondly, it is very important that local government and provinces provide the requisite water supply infrastructure. Many industries requires basic water to be able to function. So once you have that basic platform, I believe, then the next phase of industrialization would probably be your small to medium-sized industrial enterprises that perhaps have their supply chains connected to the major centers. So you can have a component manufacturer sitting maybe in the Eastern Free State who supplies certain components to a major producer in the Gauteng area. In the Gauteng area, for instance, in the industrial areas of the old Buputazana homeland, I think it is possible to integrate that industrial base into the automotive supply industry
Or even
complex
in
in the Pretoria area.
You go into the DBSA, which in its earlier formulation also served, I guess, a similar function in extending support to the homelands and also in extending support to the region. It's probably a bit different now to what it was then. But just talk to us about what that experience, I guess, gave you in your professional journey.
It was wonderful. I spent about 11 years there. And you're right. I remember vividly when the Development Bank of Southern Africa was launched. It was launched by the then Prime Minister, P.W. Botha, and seated next to him was the Foreign Affairs Minister, Peg Botha. I was doing Standard 8 at the time. And I remember those pictures vividly. And so, yes, the Development Bank, in its initial formation, was nothing else but a policy instrument for propping up development in the homeland areas. It later graduated to include the rest of the SADC region. But yeah, it was substantially transformed after 1994. New leadership was brought in. Its mandate was changed to focus primarily on infrastructure development and secondly, to cover the rest of the SADC region. So what you then heard there was a new set of skills which were brought into the organization. And the segmentation of the kind of institutions that they supported were municipalities, regional water boards. In the rest of the SADC region, they participated a lot in supporting electricity utilities, not so much in South Africa, although at a later stage I was part of a team that provided a facility to Eskom just before I left the DBSA. And then, of course, later on, and just at the time when I was joining the DBSA in 2002, it opened what was then referred to as the Private Sector Investments Division. And that's when we started participating in the financing of all sorts of private sector-led infrastructure projects. The first set of those were largely in the telecom sector. That was when telecoms was really booming and beginning. So in the early stages of financing what was then called Newtel and Cell C, projects in Ghana, in East Africa, in Kenya, as well as telecoms projects in the neighboring countries as well as energy projects. So I saw with my own eyes the portfolio of the Development Bank growing when I arrived there, probably from around 3 billion rand or so to somewhere in the order just over 40 billion rand when I left there.
Wow.
And a lot of that, yes, was driven by public sector type investments into municipalities supporting the metros, with large infrastructure financing facilities, but also parallel was large-scale investments in private sector initiatives, of which some were in the energy space in the form of independent power producers. Yeah.
Now that you mentioned that, CEO, I mean, it's quite interesting because, you know, for any child maybe who's born in the 2000s here in South Africa, they would think, you know, the track record of state involvement in the development of infrastructure, in the provision of much-needed public goods, is one utter failure. I mean, if you look at the state of many of our SOEs now, you know, those children wouldn't be blamed for thinking that there's really very limited role for some of the public agencies in getting some of this much-needed social investments on board. And yet, in many instances, the agencies you've worked with, even the one that you lead now, has in many cases taken first risk in taking some of the things that we now see as recognizable names into the market. You spoke about telecoms, and you're now even speaking about the renewable sector and some of the independent power producers. Talk to us about when you were at the DBSA, some of the things that you were doing there, and of course maybe the role of the IDC then, which is the entity that you now lead.
Yeah, I was the head of project finance at the Development Bank for some time, and later on became the head of its entire South Africa business, which was somewhere in the order of about 70% of the Development Bank's investment activity. So, to your observation, if you take into account that SANRAL, as much as we, as a development bank, did not participate extensively in its financing, SANRAL has been very successful in building a decent national road infrastructure
One
network.
of the best in the world.
One of the best in the world. If you take Transnet, for instance, for a moment, put aside the issues relating to governance, failures there, and what have you. That organization has done a lot of work in terms of the upgrading of the rail system, the building of ports in order to enhance trade, the pipeline that supplies fuel to the inland areas, and so on. The telecoms space was driven largely by the private sector. The major mobile companies were very, very much instrumental and were largely private sector funded to build and roll out the network that we enjoy today. Obviously, in recent times, and the DBSA, I remember vividly, was involved in a couple of transactions where we financed smaller players who were rolling out fiber optic networks in order to enhance capacity and so on. So yes, let's be honest, in recent years, there has been institutional failures, governance failures in some of these SOEs, but a lot of them have played their part. Just an observation on Eskom. I remember we doing a study at the DBSA, and we were looking at, and this is when the independent power producers were just coming through. And we took stock of Eskom's fleet of power stations. And at that time already, it was very clear that there was going to be a significant transition in the composition of the generation mix. And it was very clear that some of the power stations, in terms of their age, were on their last mile. And that there would have to be a replenishment program. And so, yeah, things have happened. We know the complications that have arisen out of the implementation of the build program at Eskom, but those were already on the horizon a couple of years ago. So yeah, the Development Bank, I think, has been very much at the center of doing that. The area in which it has been very difficult to expand financing in particular has been in the area of water infrastructure.
Why is that?
The complication with water infrastructure is that the value chain is as follows. You have bulk water systems, which are in the form of the dams and so on. Then you have sort of your intermediate infrastructure system made up of the water boards that acquire the water from the bulk system, clean it up to a certain level, and then sell it off to the municipalities. And then the reticulation system, which is at the level of households, passing it on to industry. And there, again, regrettably, the capacity of municipalities to receive and to reticulate water competently, we all know from various reports that there are a lot of complications. But what is making it difficult, I think, to attract private sector investment into that space is the fact that in South Africa, water, and I think rightfully so, is treated as a social good, and it is difficult to sell it on a commercial basis. So there was one interesting project that we did in Durban where wastewater gets pulled out of the reticulation system of eThekwini municipality. It then gets treated and cleaned up, but not up to potable consumption level, just enough to be sent back to industry to be used in the production processes in industry. It was a very fascinating project, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because a lot of the municipal improvement work that the DBSA currently does is in this area of water. And one of the big issues that are flagged in some instances by municipal officials is that you've got a massive challenge in many municipalities where you can't really charge the true cost of provision when it comes to water. And added to that, you maybe also have spatial challenges in the former homeland areas where you probably don't have densely populated settlements that allow you to build infrastructure, as you would maybe in a city or even in a township here in Gauteng. Some of those challenges maybe might, I guess, need some of the work of the Water Research Commission, which is, as a research institute and R&D entity, one of the best in the world.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think with advances in technologies, perhaps some of those challenges can be overcome. Yes, it is very difficult to lay down reticulation infrastructure in rural areas. It is unlike energy, for instance, where there is evolution now, technologies emerging to roll out quite credible and functional distributed energy system, be it using solar systems or wind energy systems. I mean, in the IRP5, I'm sure you saw it, there is adequate provision there for energy systems that are not necessarily on-grid. And I think what we are beginning to see is industrial enterprises and commercial enterprises using mainly solar systems on rooftops and so on. And because technology has advanced to a point where the dependency, the technical functionality of these technologies has improved so much so that electricity supply, energy supply is becoming more and more available. And indeed, that is one of the initiatives that we are beginning to take here at the Industrial Development Corporation, and that is to position ourselves not only as a financier of independent power producers, which we are going to do as that part of the energy mix grows as per the integrated resource plan. But we are also looking for energy efficiency interventions and looking for these distributed energy systems which find favor largely in rural areas.
I guess think about your period as the CEO at the Land Bank.
Yes.
It certainly did coincide in the political economy of our country with very aggressive debates around land reform and some of the failings that have been seen there.
Yes.
Talk to us about that experience and, of course, some of the things that continue to stay with you from that particular experience.
It was a very interesting and very steep learning experience for me because I'm not an agricultural economist.
Sure.
I went there to say I'm primarily a banking person and would like to facilitate financial flows into the agricultural sector. The first challenge was that, and it still remains a challenge today, and that is that that particular sector, unfortunately, is still very racially segregated. You have industry bodies that represent white people, you have industry bodies that represent black people. So just there, complications in respect of how to manage stakeholders, how to...
Competing interests.
Competing interests and what have you. But this is, amongst others, the one thing that we tried to do, and we did a couple of very successful transactions. And that was to say, if transformation is to happen in the agricultural sector, and it is to happen on a sustainable basis, yes, you need, one, to provide access to land. Two, you need expertise in terms of helping people to plan, those who are beneficiaries of land reform, to plan decently the kind of farming enterprises that they want to undertake on their land parcel. Because you would know, just because I have a land parcel doesn't mean I should bring in a tractor and start plowing.
Exactly.
The land use might be different. So expertise. In the third instance, infrastructure requirements. A lot of the land parcels suffer from inadequacy of water access or road access or even electricity access. The potential we know in the Eastern Cape will not be realized until bulk water adequacy is addressed. It will not be addressed until adequate logistics and transportation infrastructure is addressed. So that is that. And then in the fourth instance, yes, you then have to put in place financing instruments to enable people to farm. And the Land Bank is primarily a provider of debt. But what we found as we were doing work was that there was a massive gap for equity assistance. So a black person has a land parcel, they are able to farm, they need 50 million rand. You do your economic evaluation of that farming project and you say, we can only provide debt to a maximum of 40 million. I'm just making an example. Where do they get the additional 10 million rand? And that is where, together with the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Land Reform, we came up with this idea of so-called blended financing.
Sure.
To say, combine government grants together with debt instruments from the land bank in order to hopefully provide a blended lower cost of capital, and you can provide relief to entrepreneurs. But in addition to that, the fifth element is about providing technical support services. What are known as extension services. Yes. Remember, that capacity was lost out of the state over the past maybe 20 years or so. And a lot of it is embedded in the co-ops. They used to be called co-ops, and now they are called agricultural companies. A lot of that extension services expertise lies there. What is the point I'm making? The point I'm making is that we realized that we need a joint venture type model. You need a lot of joint ventures where perhaps on large scale land development initiatives, you have established farmers together with emerging farmers, establishing JV type structures and therefore bringing land and money and technical expertise as well as market access together. So trying to leverage the entire ecosystem. But the challenges remain, because even as we speak today, here at the Industrial Development Corporation, we do have an agri division. It focuses largely on promoting agro-processing.
So the value addition.
The value addition part of that. But I mean, agriculture is an integrated kind of a thing. So very often we do finance projects in which there is a significant portion of primary production. So what am I doing now? We are in the early stages of working primarily with the food producers, the major food producers in the country, together with the big retailers, because you need that demand pool in order to provide a viability prospects for financing primary agriculture. I think the other thing that is very interesting in agriculture is the prospects for exports. I mean, I was looking at statistics the other day, and of the total volumes that China imports of agricultural produce, and I can't remember the numbers, South Africa accounts for less than 0.5% of China's consumption, import of agricultural imports.
So that's a massive opportunity.
There's a massive scope. And a couple of protocols, as you know, have been signed between South Africa and China to expand exports into China. In the meat space, what the Department of Agriculture, I think, is seeking to resolve now is the phytosanitary dispensation in order to ensure that there is a proper health management on the product side. I think into the European Union, a lot of conversations are more around traceability. I remember spending some time with producers from Ireland. One of the things that they really are strong on is traceability. So a piece of agricultural product, whether it's meat or a fruit, can be traced back to a farm somewhere in Ireland using technology.
Okay. Now, I guess the other thing, CEO, just as we wrap on the agricultural part of it, is with all of the challenges that we have around climate change and the variation of our climate patterns, is the risk management. And it's quite interesting to have seen the Land Bank also introduce its insurance company and also even change how it extends financing. I mean, historically, you would have only done so to somebody who has a title deed on a land parcel. And increasingly, the recognition that land tenure forms in this country are varied and go beyond just title deeds.
You're right.
How did the Land Bank respond to that?
That's such an interesting question, and the best way to answer it is through an example. We did a project when I was there in the Eastern Cape. It is a macadamia nuts project. It is based and it is being developed on traditional land. And as you say, where there's no title deed. And the making of the project was very simple. One, it was a community that came together and they appealed to their chieftaincy or the traditional authority to provide a long-term lease. In that instance, it was something like 60 years or so on the land parcel. Once they have procured that, the second thing that they did was to get a private sector technical partner that would assist with the actual execution of the project from a land planning perspective. Because you take the land, I mean, those who know how to do these things will tell you that you need to, the topography has to be of a particular incline for the water to be able to flow, and they so selected the location in such a way that the land is next to a river system. They approached the Department of Water Affairs to obtain water rights. So yeah, a JV was then set up between the private sector partner and the local community structure there. And what did we do? On the back of that lease, we then provided the capital that was required. We provided half of the funding, and part of the funding, it was a 120 million rand project. And part of the funding was provided by the Department of Agriculture in the province, as well as the Department of Agriculture at national level. And so that project, the last I saw, was in implementation. The trees were being planted. The employment rate was something like 1 person per hectare. So it was a 300 hectare site. And so at a go, in the planting phase of the project, 300 people were employed there. And as the trees mature and the produce begins to come through, you can multiply the numbers of employment there in that regard. So, so those are the kind of things that can be done if people think through solutions.
And a project like that would have not happened if everybody was fixated on getting a title deed or
a mortgage or something like that.
Or something of that kind,
Certainly.
This focus on partnerships, I guess, is something that, or even this ability to work in that kind of way, is something that you would have brought into the IDC as well, where much of your work is really about working not only with other financiers, but with even firms themselves. Sometimes they find themselves in distress. They come to you and they say, look, we might lose 50 or 100 jobs here. Can you come on board and assist us? Maybe let's talk just briefly for some of our viewers who might not be familiar with the work of the IDC, its own genesis, coming as it does from a certain kind of history. What animal did you join about 11 months ago?
Look, we can talk for a long time if we talk about the Industrial Development Corporation. It's an incredible institution, I think. As you say, in its early stages, it was formed basically to build an industrial base for South Africa when South Africa was a pariah of the world and it was excluded from world economies and so on. It has been instrumental in setting up some of the most magnificent industrial organizations that we know today. But to your point about, I mean, post-2008 financial crisis, one of the initiatives that was taken here was for the IDC to set up not a dedicated fund per se, but an allocation of capital to assist companies in distress. Look, the organization has come a long way in terms of doing that. We continue to do it, but here's the issue. The economy of South Africa, you know better, is in a difficult space and has been on a very low growth path for many years now. And as a result, we are beginning to see serious complications because, I mean, you can only refinance and reschedule your exposures only up to a point. So what we're beginning to say as of today is that, one, yes, we want to continue assisting companies that are in difficult situations so that we maintain industrial capacity, we maintain employment. However, we require that there should be a really credible turnaround plan coming with such. So some of the encouraging steps that we take is to say to industry, who can you consolidate with? Perhaps your enterprise alone, let's say in the textile sector, is struggling to maintain viability by itself. But perhaps if it were to be consolidated with a competitor or a supplier somewhere, value chains can be integrated and the competitiveness of this enterprise can be enhanced. So we want to encourage consolidations and things like that. Secondly, can we go out to the market and seek strategic equity investors? Perhaps there's a private equity fund out there that has a thesis to invest at a low point, build the businesses and sell at the high point, so that the IDC is not the only player in the financing structure of the business. So perhaps you have private equity players who can bring capabilities. And we are encouraged by the work that government is doing, particularly the Department of Trade and Industry, with this initiative of doing master plans at an industry level. And so the first one that has been completed is this one in the textile environment, where basically you want the buyers of textile products to commit to certain volumes, and they have, so you create a demand pool.
As a market signal.
As a market signal. And then on the supply side, you then work with the industrial enterprises themselves, either to modernize their equipment, to improve efficiencies, or those who want to expand, to provide them with capital to expand their manufacturing base in order to supply into the South African market. And the same kind of work is being done in the poultry environment. The same kind of work is being done in other parts of the agricultural sector, where on the one side, you want to overcome those export hurdles, like, for instance, what we were talking about earlier on in respect of China, so that you create a market path for agricultural output, and then you can back solve to the supply side to invest in food production and expanding the supply base.